Maria will be presenting a paper called Global Standards and Local Policies in Extractive Industries, Exxon Mobil and Indigenous Communities in Russia and Alaska. And I had a chance to read the paper and it's really, really interesting. So I'll hand it over to Maria.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. So I renamed a little bit my paper. Now it is Global Standards, Corporate Diagram, and Indigenous Agency, ExxonMobil in Russia and Alaska. And I wrote my paper in co-authorship with Laura Henry from Bowdoin College and with Leah Horowitz from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In our paper, we were looking at ExxonMobil operating in two very, very different political and economic contexts. One on Sakhalin Island and another in Russia and other Point Thompson in North Slope of Alaska. ExxonMobil is one of the very well-known corporations, and as other corporations, it operates simultaneously in many, many countries. And when they operate in different countries, they usually have the standardized approach to reduce their transaction costs, and they try to approach in a similar way communities in different countries and indigenous people in different countries. So in this paper, we were looking how does transnational corporation interact with different groups of indigenous people who live proximate to territories of extraction. And we were also looking, does the implementation of TNC international and corporate commitments and to what extent is depending on the local context. In our paper, we used the two theories. One was governance generating network. Governance generating network that talks about shifting relationship between actors involved in design, transfer, and implementation of new rules. So if we theoretically look at the governance generating network, we distinguish nodes of global governance design. These are kind of situated in transnational spaces. It means that in nodes of global governance design are developed global standards which apply to particular localities or where companies or other entities are committed to these rules. For example, investment bank. If a company takes a loan from investment bank, all companies around the world just adhere to the rules developed by, for example, Bank of Reconstruction and Development. ExxonMobil is also such a node of design because it has this standardized approach and commitments which they use all over the world. So nodes of design are in transnational spaces, and extraction of oil is on the spaces of places, which means sites of implementation. Here, these global standards may be transferred into concrete practices on the ground. So here, these global standards choose to change the rules of the game. And of course, local actors who are situated in the around sites of implementation and national legislation and national actors influence on how these global standards are applied. And the third component of the governance generating network is forum of negotiation. Those forums are on different levels and they connect transnational spaces with local spaces with sites of extraction. So this GGN can operate top down. For example, if we have these standards which are applied, or it can be bottom up. For example, if there is a market campaign, a resistance movement, which takes their grievance to the local scale. And because of these resistance movements, the global standards can be changed. So this is kind of a very dynamic system through the lens of which I'm trying to analyze my case studies. Another theoretical approach is a diagram. This is a generalized approach to problem solving. Like TNCs, transnational corporations, have usually the standardized design of practices, of the policies through which they interact with the local actors when they expand to different countries, to all sites of implementation around the world. As I already told, this standardized approach helps them to avoid transaction costs when they are operating in multiple countries. And of course, there is no doubt that they need to adapt to local situations at the sites of implementation, which can kind of modify the diagram, or which can foster change in the diagram in the global scale. If we look at the ExxonMobil, its diagram includes UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, because they have this declared commitment all around the world. They also commit themselves to ILO, the Convention 169 concerning indigenous and tribal people. And they have the whole set of how they do benefit sharing when they enter different contexts in different countries, which is also pretty much standardized. And they have the specialized teams when they start the project in a new country. This specialized team of experts go there and try to figure out how to approach people and stakeholders on this site in a way that global commitments of ExxonMobil are met. Now I'm going to my case studies. The first case study was on ExxonNeftGaz Limited. This is a subsidiary of ExxonMobil operating on Sakhalin Island. And this is a consortium which is called Sakhalin 1. So it is not only one country, but ExxonNeftGaz Limited is responsible for approaching community and indigenous people. Sakhalin Island is situated in the sea of Okhotsk. It is very close to Japan, in the far east of Russia. And I was collecting my data for 2 years, from 2013 to 2015. I was doing participant observation, living there no significant periods of time, and plus doing 63 interviews. My next case study is ExxonMobil in Point Thompson. Point Thompson is ExxonMobil facility, which is on the north slope of Alaska. Kaktovik is on Barter Island, which is very close to the mainland on the north slope of Alaska. And I was doing this research also for 2 years, since 2015 until 2018, and took 67 interviews. But it was not only in Kaktovik, because I needed to understand the whole situation of the north slope of Alaska. So I was doing interviews with stakeholders in Fairbanks, in Anchorage, and the Utqiagvik and Nuiqsut. But for this paper and for this case study, I choose only Kaktovik because it is situated relatively close, 60 miles from this facility of ExxonMobil, Point Thompson. The Kaktovik community is impacted by closeness of Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and also it is not very far from Pruda Bay, which bring additional dynamics in stakeholder interaction in this place. But I'll try to focus only on interaction with ExxonMobil at Point Thompson. There is a big difference on how this project started. ExxonMobil project started on Sakhalin and in Point Thompson. On Sakhalin, there was a big uprisal, big resistance in 2005, 2006, when ExxonMobil extended its infrastructure, it was happening during the construction of new infrastructure. And this was a resistance mostly done on the local level by indigenous people who crossed the roads, but it was also supported by environmental NGOs, which were tackling investment banks and companies globally. But Exxon Limited was not taking any loans from but another company, Sakhalin Energy, was taking loan from the Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and that one suffered a lot from this green wave campaign against the infrastructure on Sakhalin Island. And despite ExxonMobil was affected much less, it still was kind of making changes the same as Sakhalin Energy because of the demands of the stakeholders on the local scale. Before that, the commitments which were declared by ExxonMobil were pretty poorly implemented. But after this green wave campaign and after Sakhalin Energy really changed its practices towards indigenous people, ExxonMobil implemented their own commitment. And then we can see that just on Sakhalin and in Kaktovik, so in North Slope of Alaska and in Sakhalin Island, this standardized approach has been applied. In both countries, ExxonMobil was supporting STEM education for indigenous youth. In both countries, it implemented grant programs for local communities, indigenous people, but they were channeled differently. In Kaktovik, it was through Kaktovik Community Foundation, and in Russia, it was the tripartite partnership with the state, because nothing in Russia can be decided without the state. So the state involvement, that is a big difference in stakeholder involvement, but still it's pretty similar grant program. In both cases, they were building infrastructure, despite they are saying that they are not really doing brick and mortar approach, and they try to empower, but there was demand from both cases, so they were building, helping with infrastructure. Then, in a very similar way, ExxonMobil hired community liaison people who were kind of intermediaries with all complaints between the company and indigenous people. And in the same way, they hired indigenous wildlife monitors who were reporting if there is to ExxonMobil in case some problem appeared on the ground. Of course, it's a lot of difference in everything. If we look at the local context in the North Slope of Alaska and in Russia, the first, of course, ownership of land and mineral rights is very, very different. National indigenous law is absolutely different. In Alaska, there is Alaska Native Claim Settlement Act, ANCSA, which allowed Alaskan natives to reclaim some territory. So Kaktovik and Nupiat Corporation has land, and Arctic Slope Regional Corporation also has land, but Point Thompson operates on the federal land. So despite that, it just affects stakeholder involvement and interest, because native corporations work with Exxon on the contractual base, so they support all developments very strongly, and they are welcoming oil industry on land of around the North Slope of Alaska. There is a huge difference in indigenous institutions and self-governance. I would say that the companies on Sakhalin Island were giving grants only for indigenous institutions which are institutionalized, and it fostered them to register and to become legal entities. Before that, it was just indigenous people populating the island. In Alaska, the indigenous associations and entities are institutionalized very, very long ago. Indigenous agency is different. In Russia, indigenous people accept different donations. They love money, they love grants, but they don't really welcome oil industry, and they kind of reflect on the damage to the livelihoods. In the North Slope, Alaska, communities are divided, and the native corporations are strongly welcoming companies, and ordinary citizens just think that their presence is unavoidable. And activism is very different. In Russia, indigenous people love to cooperate with environmental NGOs. They don't have any memories that would not allow them to do hunting and gathering coming from NGOs, restrictions or something. On the North Slope of Alaska, indigenous people still remember Greenpeace, who was against hunting of whales and seals hunting, and that's why they think that they only themselves are stewards of nature, and they don't really let environmental NGOs intervene in the stakeholders community on the North Slope of Alaska. What I also observed that there is a high level of organization isomorphism when ExxonMobil adopts benefit sharing practices. On the North Slope of Alaska, if we look at British Petroleum and ConocoPhillips, they have very, very similar benefit sharing schemes. And if you look at Sakhalin Island, Sakhalin Energy, and ExxonMobil also have very, very similar schemes, and they are also similar to what is on the North Slope of Alaska. Just everywhere, pretty much the same scheme is applied. Just if we look what we found, because what was amazing for me to learn that despite such huge difference in legislation, in ability of indigenous people to participate in decision making, despite different settings and different associations and entities institutionalized in both countries, it is still possible for the company to use this diagram, standardized approach, because finally it worked in both countries in a way that there is no big resistance, and people kind of accept operation of ExxonMobil there. But also local conditions, of course, are very important, because without this mobilization in Russia, probably the declaration of the diagram would not be implemented. But on the North Slope of Alaska, they anyway would be implemented, because all companies apply it, and all of them comply with their commitments on the global scale. So resistance and social movement in Sakhalin Island fostered implementation of the commitments and global standards on the sites of implementation in Sakhalin Island. Also, I observed that transnational corporations are mimicking each other's program, which result in isomorphism. So these can be taken into account by social movements, which can maybe address their grievances to one company, and other companies also might change their diagrams. I would say that this diagram is not something stable and not something forever. There is organization and learning intensities, and they kind of introduce lessons learned in one country to the other. For example, my informants in the North Slope of Alaska said that a lot of approaches which were practiced on Sakhalin Island was taken back to the United States when they tried to approach local population and indigenous people in Kaktovik. Despite kind of what is standardized and diagrammed up, and declarations are absolutely the same, but these kind of small, tiny things of approaching indigenous people were different. And I think it has a big potential for future research to look at how social movements change practices of transnational corporations and how transnational corporations behave locally in different sites of implementation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was phenomenal. It's so interesting to think of that form of engagement as a kind of technology. So I'm really it makes so much sense. It intersects with so much that people are talking about.